Welcome to today's webinar, Introduction to 3 AWS Security Services. Our presenter today is Pierre Little. Pierre has a wide range of experience ranging from security operations and engineering to architecture and risk management. He now brings his knowledge to helping AWS customers. As an AWS solutions architect with a focus on security, Pierre helps our customers across Australia to manage risks and design secure workloads to meet the security requirements. Today with us, we also have Danny Jenkins, David Kaplan, and Karush Larashbi. They will serve as our webinar moderators and will engage with you and answer your questions throughout the presentation while Pierre presents. Pierre, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. And thank you to our team of moderators that are going to be able to assist you with those questions today. So today we're going to be kicking off with an introduction to 3 AWS security services. And we chose these services because these are fundamentally the most 3 which are part of my favorite toolkit within the AWS environment. So what are we going to be looking at? We're going to be starting off with identity and access management. Then we're going to be moving on to AWS Config Rules. And then we'll be taking a look at AWS Cloud Trail. So we'll be kicking off today's session with identity and access management. And then we're going to kick off with the remaining services thereafter. So with identity and access management, in the security domain, there's many key aspects, but I love IAM because it's really powerful at how you can go about protecting your AWS workloads in the AWS environment. So let's look a little closer around what is identity and access management on AWS. So IAM is a web service that enables Amazon Web Service customers like yourself to manage users and user permissions in AWS. The service is targeted for use with AWS products. With IAM, you can centrally manage users and permissions that control which AWS resources users can access. So let's take a look. So I see identity and access management on the AWS platform as the front door. You manage who can walk through that door and what they can do. Yes, you own the keys to that door and you get to decide who you let through. Now you might see that front door as one door for each region, or you might treat that front door as a single door for all regions. But fundamentally the point being is you get to decide who you let in to that front door. So let's take a look at what identity and access management will look like inside the AWS account structure. So within identity and access management, you're able to provision users within your environment. Now those users also can be placed into groups. And you might want to put users into groups because you want to aggregate user permissions like you would do on your current environment. Similarly, AWS has what we call roles. Now, roles are a way that you can reduce long-lived credentials for users and groups with your environment. And we'll talk a little bit more how you can leverage roles further as well. You can also make users assume various roles. So if you don't want to put users into groups, you can put your users into roles, and thereby they can assume the permissions that are associated with those roles. When you're creating policies in your environment, the policies define the level of permissions that are assigned to either the users in your environment, the groups, or the roles that those users might be assuming. But it's not just the users and the groups within your environment. You're actually going to be able to deploy resources. And part of today is about understanding how you go about protecting access to those resources. So inside your environment, you're going to have users assuming roles, but you can also have your virtual instances that are getting policies assigned to them via those roles. So previously, where we said the users will assume roles and get the policies assigned to the roles, now you can do the same when those roles are applied to resources. So you don't have to configure specific credentials for your resources, your servers, to be able to access other AWS resources. So when you apply those roles to the resources, they will be able to, provided that the necessary policy has the permissions, those resources will be able to access other resources like a server accessing a storage location on the AWS environment. I just want to make something clear as well with regards to identity and access management. It is specifically built for managing access to the AWS resources. So if you look at your existing application authentication that you would have within your environment, You have operating systems and you have applications. Identity and access management is not the tool that you would utilize to authenticate your users against your operating system or those applications. Look at how you're doing that today in your current environment, and you can leverage that existing process or methodology. Identity and access management is there to protect and manage access to the AWS resources. So once you've gone and provisioned a user or a group and those various policies, and you want to be able to get your users to log into the AWS console, they will be presented with a login screen like this, where you would put in your account details at the top and the appropriate username and password that you've assigned to them. Now, there's lots of AWS services that can be accessed to the AWS Management Console. You can access the resources from the console, command line interface, or even our software development kits that we have available for you. So when your users log into the console for the very first time, this is the Insight console screen that they'll be presented with. Now, you can see there's a broad range of services and capabilities that the platform offers. What we're going to be focusing today on specifically is in the middle there, you would see CloudTrail, Config, and Identity and Access Management. So when you log in, and after today's seminar or webinar, when you want to log in and start testing, you'll know where to go to start leveraging all these key services. And you can start with Identity and Access Management to provision the access to that environment. So we've spoken around the policies that you might want to assign to specific users or groups or roles. But how do you get started? So to make it easier for you, AWS has provided a capability called the IAM Policy Generator. The policy generator allows you to either build out policies that allow or deny access to various resources. Now, if you look at the top there, in step one, you choose what type of policy you want to create. In this example here, I've chosen an IAM policy. Alternatively, you can also create a resource policy. In step two, you would go and define whether it's an allow or deny access policy. You would choose the appropriate service to provision access to, and what are the actions that they could do. And we'll look into those actions a little bit more closely. And what is the resource? So if a user wanted to access a specific resource, you would specify that resource name, and that resource could just be a storage node, it could be a server, it could be a database. You get to decide and build that out. So you don't have to know how to construct these policies because the policy generator will help you along that way. An example here, what I have done for you is I've provisioned access to CloudTrail for a specific IAM user. Now this is a very simple policy, but it shows you how easy it is to generate these policies and get started. Once you've gone about and generated a specific policy for your users, depending on your security requirements, you can actually go ahead and test the policy in the policy simulator. Now one thing to note inside the policy simulator, on the top right-hand side there, I've highlighted the AWS students. So when you log into the policy simulator, you would only be able to see the permissions or the policies that you want to be able to test, provided that the user you're accessing policy simulator has access to those specific policies. So with this particular user, the AWS student user doesn't have any access, so they're not able to see anything. So I've changed the user in the policy simulator to myself. And on the left-hand side, what you can see is I've selected a policy called Amazon S3 Full Access. The actual policy you can see allows me to access S3 and do anything against the S3 service. So what I want to do now that I've identified which policy I want to test in the policy simulator, I choose under the policy simulator options there which service I want to test, and the actions. You can see I've selected 4 specific actions for testing. There I can go and create a bucket. I can get objects in that bucket. I can put a bucket policy on that bucket, and I can list the buckets within my account. So once I've determined what those actions are, I run the simulation on the right-hand side, and below that you can see the results of what the policy has allowed me to do. So there you would see, based on that specific policy, I have all access to those specific actions, create the bucket, get the object, put the bucket policy, and as well as list the bucket. And it shows you on the left-hand side how that relates to the actual permissions. So just to recap on that is what you created the users, or the groups, or the roles. You're creating those policies. You're able to create those policies with the policy generator and be able to test and simulate those policies before they go into a production environment. You might have some unique requirements based on your user base. You can go ahead and test this safely within the policy simulator. But I want to take a look at what are some of the IAM best practices that we have within the AWS environment that can help you be more secure on the AWS environment. We want to start off with by reducing the amount of users that have access to the root account. The root account is the first account that you create, and it has access to everything in your account. So what we recommend is you reduce the number of users that can leverage this root account, because you want to reduce the potential misuse of those credentials. Secondly, you ultimately want to create individual users. And the benefit from that is that each individual user will have a unique set of credentials. And individual users can rotate those credentials, and each individual user would have a unique set of permissions assigned to that user. So much like you do in your current environment, if you do have an existing environment, you want to be able to give very specific access to individuals based on specific job functions. Thirdly, what you want to look at doing is configuring a strong password policy for those users. This ensures that your user's data is protected. And there's many good practices around generating strong passwords, like special characters, uppercase and lowercase. And we will look at the password policy that I've defined in the demo for my users. Secondly, following on from that, is you want to enable multi-factor authentication for those privileged users, or even any action that is of high risk. You want to require that that action can only be permitted based on multi-factor authenticated users. So a multi-factor authentication is a supplement to the existing username and password. It's a one-time PIN that you would use as part of your authentication logging into the AWS console. Much like you get through your banking environment when you get a one-time PIN when you want to make a transaction. Similarly, with multi-factor authentication, you get a one-time PIN that you would enter when you authenticate. When you're creating those users and giving them strong password policies, like I've alluded to earlier, is you want to reduce the amount of access that they require based on their job function. So this is what we call least privilege. It's easier to provision access further on if you start small and then grow that access, versus if they have access to everything, it's far harder to reduce that level of access moving forward. So this provides you an option to give more granular control. Like we mentioned previously, is you want to be able to manage permissions with groups. But now you can create groups based on a specific function or a specific action or specific role within your environment. It's easier to assign permissions to multiple users when they're in a group. It's simpler to reassign those permissions based on changes and responsibilities. So if a user is in an existing group, which is for administrators or security auditors or for developers, and they change roles or functions, it's easier enough to move them out of one group into another group where the appropriate permissions have been assigned. So you only need to update the user and not necessarily the permissions associated with that user, because automatically when they change groups, they will get the new permissions. Further on, you can actually go and restrict access with further conditions. So what we mean by that is, when you want to access resources in the AWS environment, and for example, if you want to upload content to S3, you can provide conditions to say your users can only upload content to S3 if they are coming from a specific source IP address. Also, another condition being only allow users to upload content if they have been multi-factor authenticated. And similarly, only if those users are uploading encrypted content. So you can provide very fine-grained conditions against that access requirement. You also want to be able to rotate your credentials regularly. And this is general best practices with any password authentication service or solution. You want to be able to use roles to share access. And what I mean by that is you don't have to share the credentials when you want to provision access to resources, because the role will do that on behalf of the actual instance or the server that has that role assigned to it. You're also going to be able to reduce your risk because roles provide short-term credentials versus long-term credentials. And this is great when you want to do cross-account access or you actually want to look at something like federation into the AWS environment. And what federation allows you to do is extend your identity into the AWS platform, but you can still manage your identities locally within your environment and use those existing governance processes to manage those users from cradle to grave. So here, you want to use IAM roles for EC2 instances, like I mentioned previously, because it's easy to manage the access keys on those instances. You can do automatic key rotation. You can assign least privilege access to those applications. And lastly, you want to be able to monitor the activity that you're actually provisioning. You want to be able to track that the users have the necessary permissions. They're not misusing their credentials or their privileges. So one of the things you want to be able to do is continuously monitor your baseline across that environment. And we give you the ability to do that, and we'll talk through that in the next, when we get to CloudTrail. So I want to move away from identity and access management for a little bit and look at AWS Config Rules. With AWS Config Rules, it is a fully managed service that provides you with an inventory of your AWS resources, lets you audit the resource configuration history, and notifies you of resource configuration changes. One of the common challenges that we have within an IT environment is being able to track what are the changes that are happening across my environment, when did it happen, what was the change before it happened, and what is the existing change, and what was possibly the impact of that change. So, but before diving into config rules, that's the reason why I needed to mention what config is. Because config rule lets you first have a look of what that environment looks like, and then you can set up triggers against that. So with AWS config, you get the inventory of your environment. You're able to discover new and deleted resources. You get to record the configuration changes continuously, and you can get notified when those configuration changes are happening. So let's look at the AWS config environment. So you have instances, or you have volumes or security groups on AWS. They're always changing. AWS config does four things. It records these changes for you. It normalizes these changes into what we call a configuration item. So generally when you're doing configuration management, configuration items are what are the specific individual asset or resource configuration baseline. We store that information in a data store that we manage and that you can query. Then we deliver that data for offline analysis. You get the notifications on this, what changed on the resources, the difference on those resources, and we also provide snapshots based on the current point in time review of what that particular asset might look like. So now that we understand what config is, let's take a look at what config rules are. Config rules are there to improve your governance over configuration changes to your resources. You set up the rules to check those changes against your environment. You use pre-built rules provided by AWS, so you don't have to go and build these rules for yourself. We provide a broad range of rules that are readily available inside the AWS environment. If you wanted to build your own rules, you can, and you can do that using what we call AWS Lambda to assist you with that. And these rules can be invoked automatically for continuous assessment. So just to recap, config is managing that baseline, detecting changes. You're going to be able to write rules against those changes. And you ultimately use the dashboard to visualize the compliance and identify those offending changes. So you want to be able to go into a central place, look at what was changing, look at the history, and look at what the baseline was before the change. So an example around this is if we take a look at some of the samples, you can have a look at your environment to say, what are the EBS volumes that are not encrypted across my environment? So you might have a compliance requirement to say, any of my production workloads should have an encrypted EBS volume. And you can use AWS config to continuously monitor and alert against that baseline. You can determine whether specific servers or instances must be within a specific VPC. And if it doesn't match that, then you can take appropriate action. For example, terminating that instance or shutting it down and then bringing that server up in the appropriate VPC. You can also look at the fact that some of your resources need to be tagged against a specific environment. Now, a tag, you can look at it as additional metadata associated with your instance. And a tag is what we call a key value pair. So an example could be, when we talk about environment tag, you could tag your instance to say, what is the environment, production, for example, and the value being web. So the key value is production web, and that will help you understand more of the configuration items or the baseline around the compliance around what that instance configuration should look like. And in the event you identify a tag that isn't part of your baseline or is missing a tag, you can notify the developers or email all the appropriate stakeholders. So if we take a look, previously this was what we had with AWS Config. And now we're going to take a look at the fifth element of what AWS Config and Config Rules offers you is ultimately, once we've recorded those, we've normalized them and we've stored those changes for you, the rules are there to trigger events and actions against those changes that are happening with your environment. So what ultimately happens is that relationships are being built behind the scenes. There's no setup needed for this. This is what AWS Config and Config Rules does for you. There's a bidirectional view of the relationships. An example being, if you have an EC2 instance, as well as a security group or an elastic IP associated with it, and those changes are being made, we record those changes and provide you the relationship around the impact or the dependencies against those resources that are being actively changed. So example here, we had an elastic IP address that was associated with an EC2 instance, and inside the console you can see that that relationship exists. So here, every change to a resource causes a new configuration item to be created that captures new configuration of the resource. The rules are ultimately there to check for validity. So AWS, as I previously mentioned, has a wide range of managed rules available for you in the platform that you can start to leverage from. And they require minimal or no configuration. And these rules are managed by AWS. And we'll continuously introduce more rules to make your life easier. If those rules are not appropriate for your specific security configuration or requirements, you can build out your own custom rules. And these rules are great because we realize that every environment is different and unique. So we want to be able to give you the ability to be able to extend those requirements onto the platform to meet your security objectives. So having a look quickly at AWS Config Rules, Managed Rules, we recently, last week, announced some new rules that were made available. So if you look towards the bottom, we have an IAM password policy. So you can check the password policy against your account if you wanted to. On the top left-hand side, under S3 bucket logging enabled, you can check whether your S3 buckets have the necessary logging enabled. And you might want to do that depending on the type of resources or objects that you're storing in the bucket. If it could be a highly confidential bucket, you want to make sure that only the appropriate people are accessing that bucket. And the actions that they're doing against that bucket are appropriate. Like they're only uploading documents and they're not deleting documents. So if we look at AWS rules, they're triggered by various changes. And those changes can be based on tags. So previously, as I mentioned, you might have a tag for production web, and if that tag changes, you won't be able to get notified against that. You can also be triggered against changes within your environment based on resource types or resource IDs. As your environment is changing, these rules will trigger and you'll be able to get notified. The rules evaluate the resource and store the results of those changes. So the use case in this example might be, as a security analyst, how do I determine if I'm safe? How do I determine if I am safe? What is the state of the security groups? For audit and compliance, is there any evidence? Now that I have it, what can I do? How can I improve my security posture based on the information I have available? So when I'm doing change management, what is the effect of the change that I've just made? So it helps with troubleshooting and it helps with discovery across your environment. So here is an example. We have a rule that is invoked at a specific frequency. It checks whether you have no more than 3 PCI v3 EC2 instances against your environment. So you might have a specific requirement that you need to have X amount of instances available for your part of your PCI governance, and you can write that rule to check against your environment. So we've had a look at identity and access management, AWS Config and Config Rules, and now we're going to take a look at the AWS CloudTrail. AWS CloudTrail is a web service that records AWS API calls for your account and delivers log files to you. The recorded information includes the identity of the API caller, the time of the API call, the source IP address of the API caller, the request parameters, and the response elements returned by the AWS service. This is really great to understand because being AWS web services, our services are available via APIs. Now, we spoke previously, when you're creating those users and you're creating those policies and those permissions, that activity can be recorded in AWS CloudTrail to further complement your audit and compliance requirements within your environment. Let's take a look at how that would look in a scenario. So starting on the left-hand side, you have the AWS Management Console, which is one way you can interface with the AWS platform. We have software development kits available. If you have developers or you want to experiment, we have software development kits available for you. We also have a command line interface, which is a set of tools, command line tools that we make available that you can use to query the API. So each one of those mechanisms, the console or the SDK or the AWS CLI, can be used to query the API. So as you're making those changes from one of those interfaces, you're making those changes on a growing set of services, and that can be globally or within a specific region of your choosing. But what happens is those actions now can be recorded into CloudTrail, and that is a continuous recording of those API calls that have been made. Those CloudTrail events can then be stored and archived into S3 for further analysis. You can use these API calls and events to troubleshoot against your environment. You might be wanting to identify what took place, how it took place, or what was a specific change. You've identified something, like we mentioned before, with config and config rules, but you want to do further inspection. You want to be able to see the fine-grained detail of that specific activity. So you can use CloudTrail to give you that insight. Now, these log files are delivered approximately every 5 minutes. Typical delivery within an event can be up to 5 minutes, and multiple partners actually integrate with AWS and understand how to digest these logs to help you with further analysis. So you might have a security incident and event management solution on-premise already in your environment, and you can complement and enrich that capability with the CloudTrail API events into that platform, and you can write further rules and alerts on the actions that you're seeing in CloudTrail. So when we talk about the monitoring and alarming, you can either do it with your existing environment, but you can also take CloudTrail and push CloudTrail in what we call CloudWatch. Now, I know we won't be going into CloudWatch too much today, but you can write the rules and alerts against CloudTrail events using CloudWatch. But let's take a look at how further CloudTrail is actually going to be helping you. So it's going to be able to give you security analysis. It's that visibility aspect that AWS works so hard to give you. We want to keep security familiar on the AWS platform, and one of the ways is providing that visibility. So with CloudTrail, you're tracking those changes to your resources. Who's making those changes, when they were made, from where they were made. You can use those logs for your compliance purposes and understand how the environment is changing over time. It's great as a proof of record to look at what went wrong, which was the service that was invoked or utilized on a particular action. And you're able to troubleshoot operational issues very quickly. So you can complement the information you're finding from config and config rules with AWS CloudTrail. And this is why I love talking about these two services together, because I believe they're such a good complement around providing you visibility, control from identity and access management across your environment. So if we look at CloudTrail, And when I work with a lot of my customers, they start with one account, but generally what tends to happen is they create multiple accounts for different purposes. And it might be a different account for billing purposes, a different account for production environments or non-production environments, or a specific line of business, or a specific category of or risk within the environment. So with CloudTrail, what you're able to do is to centralize all those CloudTrail events into a central account. So if you've got more than one account, with CloudTrail, you can send that information to a central account for centralized analysis. So you can aggregate that information and look holistically what is happening across your environment. You can distribute those trails. You can go on access to who can see that information across your environment, and then you can filter and format them to meet your privacy requirements, depending on what you're looking for. Because once the information is in S3, it provides a lot of access around how you want to investigate and query that information. So here on the example we have is account B on the left-hand side and account C on the right-hand side is sending the log information to account A. And there we have the IAM admin looking after those logs and centralizing them and controlling access to who can query and invoke an investigation against those actions. So we've had a quick look at identity and access management, config rules, and CloudTrail in the environment. What I want to do now is move over to a demo around what this would look like in the AWS environment. So in my console here, I've logged in to the AWS console. If I go back to the main page, you can see this is the console which we showed previously, where you have a list of all the services. I'm going to choose Identity and Access Management here in the middle. And this is the console. So once you've created or logged in, and you're going to start creating additional users, what you want to do is take the link on the top there where it says, welcome to Identity and Access Management, IAM users sign-in link. So you can copy this link and send it to your users once you've created an account for them to be able to log into the environment with. So you can see here I've got a security status of my account, which by default is enabled on every new account or in every existing account. And this is just a quick overview around the security posture of that account. So activate MFA on the root account. So this checks whether you have multi-factor authentication on the root account. So talking about our best practices, we give you an option here to have a look around what your environment looks like. Creating individual IAM users. So you want to reduce the amount of users that have access to IAM. You can see in the top right-hand side here, I've logged on with a specific user called Webinar Demo. I'm not using the root account. Am I using groups to assign permissions? Yes, I am. Apply an IAM policy, password policy? Yes, I've configured a password policy and I've applied it. And am I rotating my access keys in my environment? So this is a nice check across your environment when you log in. So on the left-hand side here, we have the groups, the users, and the roles and the policies which we spoke about. So if we look at the users here, I can go and create a new user. We call it the live demo user. Here, I can show my security credentials. For all intents and purposes, for privacy reasons, I won't be showing those on the live demo. I can download those credentials to my environment, and I can close this. So now that I have a live demo user, you would see by default, we don't attach any policies or permissions to users. So what we can go and have a look at is, are there any groups associated with this user? No. And what are the security credentials? So when you log in here, that's the access key. You can't see the secret key from the console for privacy reasons. The sign-in credentials, what we can do is go and manage the password. So here we can go and choose a specific password for this user. We can auto-generate the password, or we can assign a custom password to the user. And then we can require that the user change their password at next login. So here we choose to have multi-factor authentication enabled for this user. So if we say manage multi-factor device, we can say we have a virtual MFA device. So if you wanted to use, for example, the Google Authenticator, you can install that on your phone, choose the virtual MFA device and then scan this QR code on your device and then input the 2 keys or the one-time PIN passwords that you would get from that device. And if you had SSH keys for code, then you can upload those keys here. So we have a user that has no permissions and is part of no groups. Let's go have a look at the groups here. I've got a set of groups, administrator and config demo. I'm going to create a new group. I'm going to call it live demo group. Next step. So inside here, we can attach a policy to this group. As we previously mentioned, you can either assign a policy to a user or assign a policy to groups or to roles. I'm going to assign the policy to the group here. Now what you see here is that there's different policy types. There are the AWS managed policies. Now these are policies that we create on your behalf as part of the platform to make it easier for you to assign permission to your group. Alternatively, you can create your own policies. Much like we spoke about previously, you can use the policy generator and the policy simulator to test those policies. And once you're happy with them, you can choose to go and create the policy inside here. An example being I've created 3 custom policies here. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to say no filter. And for this user, I'm going to make them an administrator. I'm going to say next. And create. So now I've created the group, I've created the policy associated to that group, live demo group. And you can see the administrator access the policy associated with that group. But you can see I still don't have any users with that group. So from here we can go and add the live demo user into that group for the appropriate permissions. And then you can see we can either remove the user and we can see the user from here. So Access Advisor within Identity and Access Management shows you when last the access permissions that were applied to that group have been utilized. So because I've just created this group, you'll see on the right hand side it says not accessed in the tracking period, because as time goes on and I start to use this group and I start to use this user, that will start to populate around when I last used those permissions. And this is really great because it helps you identify if you've over-provisioned access for your users, and you can start to reduce the amount of access that they have, thereby reducing your risk in your environment. So if we look at roles, so here is a group of, or a bunch of custom roles that I've created. So we can create a new role, call it the live demo role to remain consistent. Next step. And here I'm going to say the service role here is an EC2, so I'm going to select EC2 at the top. You can choose roles for cross-account access or federation like I previously mentioned, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to choose EC2. I'm going to select that role. And what permissions am I going to be able to give to that role? So similarly, like you did with the group, here you can do with the role. And I can just give this role the security audit role and assign that, and then create the role. So now when we go into the live demo role here, you can see I've attached that specific policy. Once again, we have Access Advisor here, which will start tracking that access, and the trust relationship. The trust relationship is there to identify who can assume into this role and get those appropriate permissions. So we spoke around the policy generator. So here on my screen, you can see I've gone to the policy generator. I've selected the IAM policy from the options list here. I'm saying I want to be able to allow access for a specific resource, or I want to be able to deny access. So in here, I'm going to choose S3. So this is a list of services that you can choose from. So I'm going to allow access to S3. What am I going to allow access to? I'm going to say I'm going to allow access to everything in S3. If you want to be more specific or fine-grained, you can choose only to create a bucket or delete a bucket or any of the other capabilities there. For today's purposes, I'm just going to say all actions against any resource for S3. And I'm going to add that statement. So what happens now is we start building up the policy here. So you can see the best is allowed on S3, any of those resources with no conditions. So if you wanted to create additional conditions, you go here as an optional aspect to build out those conditions like we previously mentioned. What is the source IP address? Is the document required to be encrypted when we upload it? Or must the user be multi-factor authenticated, as an example? So now we're going to generate that policy, and if you see here, we've generated a policy that says S3 allows star resources. This is a very simple policy, and it is very similar to the existing policy that we have here inside the identity and access management. If we go to our policy that we showed previously, and we do a list for S3 full access, if we look at the actual policy here, you can see it's exactly the same. So before you go and create your specific policies on the policy generator, have a look in the manage policy section here, because you might find that that access has already been created for you and you just need to apply it. So there we just finished up on the policy generator. Moving into the policy simulator, you can see I've logged in with the webinar demo account. I can see my list of users there. Let's refresh that. So there's my live demo account that I've just created. That's the policy associated with that account. So what I'm going to do in the policy simulator, I want to be able to go and test access to any particular service. So in a common one that everybody likes to see is access to S3, and it goes in line with what we saw previously. So against S3, what are the actions that I want to test against? So I'm going to select all for this purpose. And you can see these are all the actions that are going to be tested against that particular simulation. And on the right-hand side here, now I'm going to go and run that simulation. You can see here the 49 actions selected. All of them were allowed. And you can see here with the green confirmation that that permission allows me to access all those resources. Going back, if you wanted to test something else, I have another account there, also administrator. If we had a config demo, it only has security audit and config access here. So if I want to test this policy against S3, let's run the simulation, and you can see I'm denied access against S3 because the security auditor and the config role does not provide me access to be able to go and do these specific actions against S3. Okay. So we've had a look at identity and access management in the demo, how to create users, assign users to groups, roles, how to create a policy and apply that to either a user or a group, having a look at the policy generator, and having a look at the policy simulator. So now I want to have a look at AWS Config. So here you can see I've created additional rules already within my environment. But before we dive into these rules, let's go and create a new rule. So from here, as you saw previously, these are all managed rules. So we're looking at the AWS managed rule set. So here we can say, let's use this rule, approved AMIs by ID. So here we can say approved AMIs by ID checks whether running instances are using a specific AMI. So inside this rule, we would need to specify the AMI ID. We want to look for changes against that, against what's the specific resource, and that would be against EC2. And if you only wanted to do it against a specific resource that matched the specific tag that we mentioned previously, like production web servers, then we put that specific rule parameter into this rule to be able to monitor against that. So coming back to the rules that I've already created here, you can see an encrypted volume rule, identity and access management password policy, whether I have an elastic IP attached to my environment, do I have CloudTrail enabled, do I have restricted SSH access to my servers, is my root account multi-factor authentication enabled, do I have that enabled for my root account, and do I have restricted common ports on my security group. So let's take a look at the encrypted volumes here. So you can see these are the EC2 volumes, the rule, so its configuration changes against the resources EC2 volumes. And here, these are the volumes that I have created in my account, and there's only one of them that is compliant. So if we have a look at the rule change now, of the configuration history, This is the timeline of that event. So you can see I created this rule on the 9th of November, 2 days ago. And it shows you the properties around the volume ID, in which region, when. It also shows you the relationships. So we spoke about relationships previously. Here's the relationships that this volume that I'm evaluating is assigned to this specific resource. So I can identify what's the risk within my environment on this particular resource. If I wanted to, I could go and click against this resource. It will take me directly to the EC2 management console and show me this running resource. Now if you select that resource, you can see here these are the block devices associated with it. And if you wanted to click on one of these, you can see here this is the EBS volume, it's attached. So coming back to the config console, we're going to go back to the other rules that we have available. This one here, the IAM password policy, this one's pretty relevant in the sense that my rule wants to look for uppercase, lowercase, symbols, numbers, the password length, the password reuse, and the max password age. If we go back into the IAM console here, and we look at the dashboard, and we say, yes, I do have an IAM password policy enabled, but is it effective? And this is where config rules can complement your identity and access management strategy. So when we manage the password policy, we can see here that I have at least one uppercase letter, one lowercase letter, one number, one alphanumeric character. I'm allowing users to change their password, but what I'm not doing inside here is looking at the password expiration. So here we want to be able to enable the password expiration of 90 days. We're going to be able to prevent the reuse of the password, number of passwords to remember, and now these numbers can align with your existing security requirements within your environment. I might just choose 12. I can even just choose 24. And password expiration requires administrator reset. I can apply that password policy, and every user within my environment now will be required to match these password conditions. Looking at identity and access management, there's a credential report, and you can download this credential report where you'll be able to review all the users, the last time they changed their password policy, the last time that it was accessed, and additional associated attributes for their account. So you might want to download this report on a regular basis as part of your standard security checks. So coming back to config, we've evaluated that this rule and find that I'm non-compliant based on the specific requirements. So as time goes on, when this rule is reevaluated, if I run it now, it will take some time, and when we come back, I'll be in compliance with this particular rule. So we go back to the rule selection here. The example being CloudTrail enabled. Now, one of the best practices that we didn't mention that is really important as part of your account strategy is when you create and enable new accounts, it's one of the things you definitely want to be doing is enabling CloudTrail, because you want to be able to get that visibility around what is happening across your environment. So not only do you want to enable CloudTrail, but you want to be able to check if CloudTrail is enabled across all your regions and also when it is disabled. So if somebody inadvertently went and disabled CloudTrail, you have a config rule here checking when that happens and what the configuration would look like. So you can see on this particular account, I've got nothing actionable because I am compliant, and there's no timeline because nothing's changed. So since I've been monitoring config or CloudTrail, there's no change against this. So here, restricted SSH access. So if you have a Linux environment, or it could be a Windows environment, you can use a different rule for RDP access versus SSH for Linux. So restricted SSH access looks whether a specific security group is compliant and doesn't allow SSH access. So once again, if we look at that, there's nothing to change. We click on the config timeline to show you when I created this rule on the 9th, then there were changes that were happening against every event. So let's look at the relationship first. So this relationship, we can see on this EC2 instance, this network interface, this security group has been attached. And on this instance, as well as is associated with this VPC. So if you look at the specific event, you can see that at that point in time on the 9th of November, a change was made against this specific EC2 instance. That was 5:42:51. 5:52:49, another event. Again, another instance occurred. Once again, you can go look at the timeline there for that particular instance, what's been changing. Oops. Sorry, so I've gone into the instances, let's close that. So there are no changes found on that particular resource, but only the relationship for that resource. So if we go back here, and we look at MFA enable, on the root account I have this rule, looking for multi-factor authentication on my root account, and then you can see I'm compliant, and that's the last run time was at 5:23, and this is Sydney time. As you can see, I'm logged into the Sydney region, and that's the next evaluation that ran. So that is the rule. So having a look at the resources, so if I had a resource type, here I wanted to look at CloudTrail specifically, I can do a lookup just for that particular resource to find out what it looks like. So here we go, I can say CloudTrail in my environment, what is the config timeline? So you don't necessarily have to go just the rules, you can come back to the resources here and have a look. So the settings, inside there, you can turn it on or turn it off. You want to be able to record all the changes across the supported regions. What is the S3 bucket where those snapshot and configuration files are going to be? And here's the SNS topic. This is where you're going to be able to get notified against specific changes within your environment. And what is the role or the permissions that you're going to give AWS Config to be able to run within your environment? So we had a look at how the information within identity and access management, when you're creating that, how you can manage that and for compliance and configuration changes using AWS Config. I want to take a look at CloudTrail. So on the CloudTrail site or inside your account, when you log in, you can go and say add new trail. So we can call this trail live demo trail. And here is we choose whether we want to apply this specific trail to all regions or only the region I'm operating. And this is really your preference. You might want to go into every region and set up a cloud trail in every region, or you want to just do it centrally here. So for today's demo, I'm just going to choose apply trail to all regions. I'm not going to create a new S3 bucket. I can just go and use an existing S3 bucket that I've already created based on my previous cloud trail. And from an advanced point of view, I can choose whether I want all this information that I'm going to be storing in S3 for AWS CloudTrail, whether I want those files encrypted. We can do log file validation, so you can use this to identify any tampering against those log files. And you can also get a notification when those log files have been delivered. So I'm going to create. And then you can see I've got the trail that's been created. It's applied to all the regions. It includes all the global services. It's going to a specific S3 bucket. I haven't encrypted them. We can go and modify that if we wanted to and choose to encrypt those files. We can push to SNS if we wanted to. But here's also previously what I mentioned is AWS CloudWatch logs. So if you wanted to, you can configure that these CloudTrail events go to CloudWatch, where you can write further rules based on the information that is coming from AWS CloudTrail. And one of those rules that I created on my account is every time a root user logs onto my console or into my environment, I want to be able to get notified. Because if it's not me logging on, that's not a good thing. And so I get an email notification every time that is enabled. So here you can see CloudTrail configuration at the top-hand side. And in the right-hand box, we have the toggle box to turn it on and off. Now, if you turn this off and you have the config rule enabled, then you'll be able to get notified. So here we've got two trails. So because I've got CloudTrail enabled here on this one, it's still going to be enabled for my account. So coming back, how these two complement each other, identity and access management, creating those users. For the access control within your environment, That's where you're going to use identity and access management. Manage who can get access to those specific resources within your environment. You're going to look at config rules for the continuous evaluation against your environment. What are those best practices, the misconfigurations, or the actions on those particular changes that are occurring within your environment? Looking at CloudTrail, look at it as another set of capabilities around auditing your particular environment. The audit trail is going to give you information around who did what, when, and from where on your particular environment. So if you look at those three services, these tools aid you for security in the cloud. And AWS Security and Compliance, we've gone through extensive effort to deliver attestations around the security posture of the cloud, and this is what we call security of the cloud. Now, AWS does have a shared responsibility model, and with this, you're able to leverage off those capabilities to be able to be more compliant in your environment and meet your specific organization requirements. So the information that I've gone through today is identity and access management. These are the links that you'll be able to access to be able to find out more information on where to start and how to do what you've done in today's demo. So AWS Config and Config Rules working together, CloudTrail for further insights around all the API calls that have been made against your environment, as well as the AWS Policy Generator to get you started and creating policies for your environment. And then the simulator, so you can simulate those actions to make sure that they are appropriate based on the permissions and requirements for your users. So with that, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to attend the webinar today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you can go away from today and start practicing in creating those accounts and resources and access securely within the AWS environment. Thank you very much, everybody.